The night had started out like a celebration. Emma Carter stood in front of the mirror in their high-rise apartment, adjusting the thin gold chain around her neck. She could hear the city humming below, traffic lights blinking, horns in the distance, the occasional burst of laughter from a passing group of strangers. It was supposed to be a special night. Mark had just been promoted to senior vice president at Bradford & Cole, one of the most prestigious financial firms in the city. She had spent the afternoon preparing his favorite dinner, grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of vintage Chardonnay she'd been saving for months. The dining table was set with candles. She even wore the deep green dress he once told her made her eyes look like emeralds. When the door finally opened, Mark stepped in, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit. But there was something different about him. His smile was faint, almost forced, and his eyes didn't linger on her the way they used to. He set his briefcase down, loosened his tie, and walked toward the table. "Congratulations," she said softly, moving to kiss him. He kissed her back, but it was quick, perfunctory, as if they were exchanging pleasantries with a stranger. They sat down to eat, and she tried to fill the silence with stories from her day, but his responses were clipped. His phone buzzed several times, and each time he checked it, his jaw tightened. Halfway through the meal, Mark put his fork down and leaned back in his chair. "Emma, we need to talk." Her stomach tightened. She hated those 4 words. "About what?" He didn't touch his wine glass. "I think it's time we ended this, the marriage." The words were so sudden, so blunt, that for a moment she thought she had misheard. "What?" "I've been thinking about it for a while," he said, his tone flat. "This isn't working anymore. I've already spoken to a lawyer." She stared at him, waiting for a crack in his expression, some sign that he was joking, or that this was a moment of temporary insanity. But he reached into his briefcase and slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside, she saw her name printed above the word "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." Her hands trembled as she touched the papers, the legal language blurring in front of her eyes. "This is a joke," she whispered. "Mark, we just celebrated your promotion. We're supposed to be—" "This isn't about my promotion," he cut in, though his eyes darted away from hers. I don't feel the same way anymore. I need to focus on my career and other things." The other things landed like a stone in her gut. She wanted to ask if there was someone else, but deep down she already knew the answer. The late nights at the office, the sudden distance, the way he had stopped asking about her day, stopped noticing the little things. She thought she'd been imagining it. Now she knew she hadn't. Emma pushed back her chair, the legs scraping against the polished wood floor. "You could have at least had the decency to talk to me before deciding to throw away our marriage like trash." "I'm talking to you now," he said coldly, as if that excused everything. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She walked to their bedroom, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She pulled a suitcase from the closet and began packing without thinking. Just a few clothes, her laptop, the framed photo of her parents. Every sound of a zipper closing felt like a crack in the life she had built. Mark didn't follow her. He didn't try to stop her. By the time she returned to the living room, suitcase in hand, he was already scrolling through his phone. At the doorway, she looked back at him for what she knew would be the last time in that apartment. "One day, Mark, you're going to realize what you've thrown away. And when that day comes, I won't be there." He didn't even lift his head. The elevator ride down felt endless. When the doors opened to the cool night air, the city seemed different, colder, more indifferent. She walked out onto the street, dragging her suitcase behind her. Somewhere above, in the apartment they had shared, her old life was already fading. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would never come back. 3 years had passed since the night Emma walked out of that apartment with a suitcase and a heart in pieces. In those years, the timid, uncertain woman who once begged for her husband's attention had been replaced by someone entirely different. Someone polished, self-assured, and in full command of her own life. It hadn't happened overnight. The first year was the hardest. She had moved into a small, one-bedroom flat in a quieter part of the city, far from the skyline views she once took for granted. She worked long hours at a boutique marketing agency, often staying late into the night, not just to keep her mind busy, but to prove to herself she could succeed without anyone's help. She attended networking events, not because she liked them, but because she had learned the brutal truth. Survival in this city depended on connections as much as skill. Every handshake, every exchanged business card was another step out of the shadow of her past. It was at one of those events, in a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the river, that she met Alexander Grant. He wasn't just another well-dressed man with a charming smile. His presence seemed to shift the air in the room. People moved differently around him, their voices softer, their laughter more deliberate, as if afraid to waste a second of his attention. He was the kind of man people either feared or respected, often both. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, when his eyes found hers across the room, she didn't look away. Their courtship wasn't rushed. Alexander was deliberate in everything he did, from the way he poured her wine during their first dinner to the way he remembered small details about her work. With him, she felt something she hadn't in years: stability. Not the illusion of it, but the real kind. Within 2 years, she had gone from being a mid-level marketing manager to the wife of one of the city's most reputable and formidable CEOs. Now, their lives were a far cry from the cramped apartment she once shared with Mark. The Grant estate was a sprawling mansion set behind high iron gates, its driveway lined with cherry blossom trees that bloomed every spring. Mornings began with coffee on the terrace, overlooking the gardens Alexander's family had maintained for generations. Emma had a team of assistants, a driver, and a schedule filled with charity galas, corporate functions, and private dinners with high-profile guests. She had built not only a new life, but a new identity, one no longer tethered to the heartbreak that had once defined her. But change has a way of arriving when you least expect it. It was late on a Tuesday afternoon when Emma stepped into Alexander's private office. He was at his desk reviewing a thick folder of personnel changes for an upcoming company restructuring. The Grant Corporation was expanding and new hires were flooding in. She moved to sit across from him, casually flipping through one of the staff rosters he had left on the table. Her eyes skimmed the list, department names, job titles, starting dates, until one name stopped her cold: Mark Reynolds. She read it twice, certain her mind was playing tricks. But there it was in black ink: Senior Account Manager, starting next week, reporting directly to the Executive Division, the division Alexander personally oversaw. Her fingers tightened on the page, and for a moment the polished exterior she had so carefully built threatened to crack. Alexander glanced up, noticing the stillness in her expression. Something wrong? Emma forced a small smile, though her heart had begun to pound. No, just recognizing a name. She didn't say more. She couldn't. Not yet. But as she left Alexander's office and walked down the marble corridor, her heels clicking against the polished floor, memories came rushing back. The sound of a suitcase wheel dragging across a cold city street, the manila envelope with her name above the words "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." The last glance she'd given him before stepping into the night. And now, after 3 years, fate, or perhaps something darker, was bringing him back into her world. Only this time, the balance of power was entirely different. She was no longer the woman who left in tears. She was the wife of his new boss. And in the world of Alexander Grant, subordinates either learned their place or were swiftly removed from it. Emma closed the folder and set it aside. The corners of her mouth lifted, not in joy, but in something colder, sharper. The game was about to begin. The ballroom glowed under a canopy of crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished marble floors and the glittering gowns of the city's most influential. A string quartet played near the stage, their music weaving seamlessly with the soft hum of conversation and the clink of champagne flutes. Emma had been to dozens of these events since marrying Alexander, but tonight the air felt heavier, charged with something she couldn't name. Yet, she stood at Alexander's side as they entered, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, guiding her through a sea of nods and handshakes. Every step was choreographed elegance. This was the world she had mastered. The whispers followed them, as they always did, about her dress, her poise, her role in Alexander's life. She met every glance with the same serene smile, but beneath it, her thoughts still lingered on the name she had seen in that folder just days ago. Mark Reynolds. She hadn't told Alexander. Not yet. Part of her wanted to see it happen, to watch the exact moment their paths crossed again, when the man who discarded her would realize she wasn't just doing fine after the divorce. She had risen far above him. The evening moved forward with the usual rhythm, Alexander greeting board members, Emma exchanging polite words with their wives. Waiters floated by with trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres. She was mid-conversation with the chairman's wife when, from across the room, she caught sight of a tall figure entering through the side door. It was him. Mark looked almost exactly the same as the night she'd left, though perhaps a little older, a little leaner, his jaw set in that familiar way that made him seem confident to anyone who didn't know the cracks beneath. He wore a charcoal suit, crisp and tailored, but it wasn't the clothes that made her pause. It was the way his eyes scanned the room with calculated precision, the way he held himself like a man trying to fit into a role just slightly too big for him. For a moment, she simply watched him shake hands with an executive, watched the way his smile curved, polished but not warm. He was clearly here to impress. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Then Alexander spotted him. "Mark Reynolds," Alexander said with an easy smile as the man approached, extending a hand. "Good to have you on board. I've heard promising things from your last apartment." Mark shook his hand firmly, his posture straight. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. I'm looking forward to." His voice faltered. Alexander had stepped slightly aside, revealing Emma. The pause was brief, but to Emma, it stretched into eternity. She saw it happen, the recognition flooding his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the way his confident smile froze and slipped into something stiffer. "Emma?" he said finally, the word almost a breath. She tilted her head slightly, her own smile perfectly polite. "Mark, it's been a while." Her voice was calm, but inside she felt a strange, exhilarating mix of satisfaction and adrenaline. Alexander glanced between them, his brow faintly furrowed, but said nothing yet. He was a man who noticed details, and Emma knew he was filing this moment away. "Yes," Mark said, clearing his throat. "I didn't realize you." "We're married to your new boss?" she finished lightly, as if commenting on the weather. "Life is full of surprises." The words hung in the air between them, gentle in tone, but heavy in implication. Mark forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It is." A nearby executive called Alexander over to discuss a pending acquisition. He excused himself with a quick squeeze of Emma's hand, leaving her standing with Mark. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The music swelled in the background, glasses clinked, but in that small pocket of space, it was just the two of them. 3 years of silence pressing against the edges of this reunion. "You look different," Mark said finally, his gaze moving over her with a mix of curiosity and something darker. "I am different," she replied simply. People change when they stop being underestimated. Something flickered in his expression, but before he could respond, Alexander returned, his arm slipping around Emma's waist as naturally as if it had always been there. "Shall we?" he asked her, and she nodded, letting him guide her away. She didn't look back, but she could feel Mark's stare following her across the room. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that tonight was only the beginning. Mark's first week at the Grant Corporation began with a thick orientation packet, a series of executive-level briefings, and the quiet but constant awareness that the company's reputation for precision and discipline was no exaggeration. Everything here moved with military efficiency, from the way emails were drafted to the way meetings started exactly on time, not a minute more, not a minute less. It didn't take long for him to realize the most crucial detail of all. His position as senior account manager placed him directly under Alexander Grant's supervision. There would be no middle managers to act as buffers, no layers of bureaucracy to shield him from the CEO's eyes. Every major report, proposal, and client interaction would cross Alexander's desk. And where Alexander went, Emma inevitably followed. The first time it happened was during the Monday morning executive briefing. Mark entered the glass-walled conference room 5 minutes early, hoping to claim a seat toward the middle where he could blend into the crowd. The room was sleek, modern, and intimidatingly silent, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A long mahogany table stretched through the center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. He had just opened his laptop when he saw them enter. Alexander in a perfectly cut navy suit, Emma in a cream silk blouse and fitted skirt, her hair pulled into a low twist that looked both effortless and deliberate. She wasn't carrying a notebook or a laptop, yet every executive straightened subtly as she passed, as though her presence alone carried weight. Alexander greeted the group with a curt nod, then glanced at Mark. "Reynolds, I'll want to see your projections for the Bellington account by Thursday. Emma will be sitting in on that review." Mark's fingers froze on his keyboard. "Of course," he said, keeping his voice even. Emma took the seat beside Alexander, directly across from Mark. Throughout the meeting, she said little, but every so often her eyes would lift from the agenda to meet his, holding his gaze just long enough to remind him she was watching. She didn't smirk, didn't frown, just observed. It was unnerving. Over the next few days, their paths crossed in ways that were impossible to dismiss as coincidence. In the elevator, she would step in just as the doors began to close, her perfume a soft echo of a life he once knew. At lunch, she'd appear in the executive dining lounge, seated with Alexander at a table where Mark could see them but not hear their conversation. Even in the hallway, her presence was a quiet pressure, a reminder that his past and his present were now locked in the same orbit. The real test came during a high-stakes client meeting on Friday. Mark had spent the week preparing his pitch, rehearsing every detail until it was airtight. But when he walked into the boardroom, he found Emma already there, seated beside Alexander, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Emma will be observing," Alexander explained, gesturing for Mark to begin. He launched into his presentation, keeping his tone measured, his slides sharp. But every time he glanced up, her eyes were on him, not hostile, not warm, just assessing. It was like speaking while balancing on a knife's edge. When he finished, Alexander leaned back, silent for a moment before turning to Emma. "What do you think?" She tilted her head slightly. "It's fine," she said. Then, with a faint lift of her brows, "But fine doesn't win contracts worth 8 figures. Perhaps Mr. Reynolds can tighten the value proposition before Monday. Be more persuasive, less safe." The word lingered like an insult. "Safe," Alexander nodded. "Good point. Monday it is, Reynolds." Mark forced a polite smile, but inside he was seething. This wasn't just scrutiny, it was control. Every meeting, every conversation was a chance for her to undermine him, subtly and without breaking a single corporate rule. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't accusing, she was simply there, present. And every time she spoke, it was with just enough authority to make him feel small without anyone else noticing. By the end of the week, Mark understood the new reality. He had stepped into a company where his ex-wife wasn't just part of his professional life. She was an unshakable fixture in the very space he needed to succeed. And she was playing the long game, one calculated move at a time. The message was clear. Here, in the Grant Corporation, power didn't just belong to Alexander. Emma had it too, and she was making sure Mark knew it. By the second week, the tension was no longer something Mark could ignore. It had become the invisible third party in every meeting, every hallway exchange, every strategic discussion. Emma was always there, not in an overt way, but like the subtle shift in air pressure before a storm. She didn't speak often, yet her comments carried weight. Her nod of approval could seal an idea, and her silence could kill it. At first, he told himself it was paranoia. The Grant Corporation was enormous, and Alexander was the one making decisions. But the more he observed, the more he began to notice a pattern. Proposals Emma approved seemed to move through faster, and those she didn't quietly died before they reached implementation. One evening, sitting alone in his office, the glow from his laptop reflecting off the darkened windows, he found his mind pulling him backward, to the moment everything had begun to unravel. It was 3 years ago, just days before his promotion at Bradford & Cole. The firm's managing partner had called him into a closed-door meeting. The offer had been straightforward: senior vice president, a substantial salary bump, and access to the firm's most lucrative clients. But there had been an unspoken expectation: more time at the office, more socializing with high-level clients, and, in the managing partner's words, the kind of image that fits the role. That image, apparently, did not include Emma. It hadn't been an explicit order, but the implication was there. She didn't match the sleek socialite look the partners wanted at charity events and networking galas. She worked a standard job, dressed simply, and preferred quiet nights at home over schmoozing with corporate elites. To the partners, she didn't fit the part of a rising executive's wife, and Mark, hungry for the role and everything it promised, had chosen the promotion over his marriage. He remembered the night he decided. He'd been at a rooftop bar with a senior client and a few colleagues, the city skyline glittering beyond the glass railing. A woman named Claire, polished, charming, the kind of person who seemed born into this world, had leaned close to whisper, "You'd move faster here without distractions." Her glance had been brief, but the message was clear. 2 weeks later, he'd slid divorce papers across a candlelit dinner table. Now, as he sat in the Grant Corporation's sleek executive office, the weight of that decision pressed against him harder than it had in years. Emma wasn't just thriving. She was seated at the right hand of one of the most powerful CEOs in the city, her presence shaping conversations he was desperate to be a part of. The next morning, during a departmental strategy session, he decided to test his theory. He proposed a bold restructuring plan for the Bellington account, complete with risk analysis and projected ROI. Alexander listened intently, asking questions, but when his gaze shifted to Emma, she simply tilted her head and said, "It's ambitious, but timing is everything. Perhaps we revisit this next quarter." Alexander nodded once. "Next quarter it is." Just like that, the discussion ended. Mark kept his expression neutral, but inside, the confirmation burned. Emma's voice could redirect the CEO's decisions in a single sentence, and if she wanted to, she could use that influence to keep him running in circles, never quite reaching the top. That night, lying in bed in his small apartment overlooking the noisy street below, he stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once left her behind to climb higher, and now she stood between him and every rung of the ladder he wanted to reach. The past wasn't finished with him, not by a long shot. And for the first time since joining the Grant Corporation, Mark began to wonder if he'd stepped into a game where Emma wasn't just a player. She was the one writing the rules. The announcement came on a rainy Thursday morning, the kind of day where the city's skyline looked like it was fading into mist. Mark had just settled at his desk when an email from Alexander's office landed in his inbox. Subject, Project Apex Leadership Team Assignment. He clicked it open and scanned the list. There it was in bold. Lead strategist, Mark Reynolds. Client Relations Director, Emma Grant. For a moment, he thought he'd misread it. But no, it was there in black and white, his ex-wife's name directly tied to his own. Project Apex was the company's most ambitious campaign of the year. A multi-million-dollar partnership with an international tech firm. It was high profile, high risk, and highly visible. Success could launch him into the next echelon of leadership. Failure could bury him. And now Emma was tethered to that outcome. They met later that morning in conference room 12B, a sleek glass space with a sweeping view of the river. Emma was already there when he arrived, seated at the head of the table with her tablet open. She didn't look up when he walked in, but he could feel the air tighten. "Mark," she said finally, her tone crisp but professional. "We need to align our approaches before Monday's client briefing. I've reviewed your preliminary strategy, and there are adjustments to be made." He slid into the chair opposite her. "Adjustments?" he asked, forcing a neutral expression. She glanced up, meeting his eyes with that steady, unreadable gaze. "You're focusing too much on aggressive expansion. The client wants sustainable growth. If we pitch the wrong angle, we'll lose them before we start." He leaned back, arms crossing. "Funny, I don't remember you being the cautious type." Her lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. "And I don't remember you being the kind to listen." The words stung more than he expected, and for a moment, they weren't in a glass-walled conference room. They were back in their old apartment, mid-argument, with the same undercurrent of unresolved history. They worked through the morning, their exchanges laced with a careful politeness that was just sharp enough to cut. He would present an idea, and she would counter with a better one, or at least one the client would likely prefer. She didn't raise her voice, didn't roll her eyes, but her precision made it clear she was in control of the conversation. By lunchtime, the whispers had already started. In the executive dining lounge, Mark caught snippets as he passed. Two junior managers exchanging knowing glances. One murmuring, "You know she's his ex, right?" Another replying, "Explains a lot." In the elevator, he overheard someone say, "Can you imagine having to work with your ex every day? In front of your spouse?" Followed by muffled laughter. Emma didn't seem fazed by any of it. If she noticed the gossip, she ignored it, moving through the office with the same composed confidence she'd worn since the day he saw her again. But Mark knew better. Office rumors had a way of slipping into boardroom perception, of shaping narratives without anyone realizing. And this narrative threatened to paint him as a man defined by his past, not his present. The tension reached a breaking point during a late-night prep session in the small strategy hub. The office was quiet, most of the staff gone, rain streaking the windows. They were going over the final slide deck when Mark finally broke the pattern. "Do you enjoy this?" he asked suddenly. Emma didn't look up from her tablet. "Enjoy what?" "Having me here, watching me scramble to keep up while you—" He gestured vaguely at her, frustration threading through his voice. "While you hold all the cards." She set the tablet down and met his gaze. "You think this is about revenge?" "I think," he said, leaning forward, "you've been waiting 3 years for a chance to see me under your thumb." Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. 3 years ago, you made a choice, Mark. You chose a title over a marriage, a network over a partner, and now you're in a position where you have to prove yourself again, this time without burning the people you work with. If that feels like being under my thumb, maybe you should ask yourself why. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, a car horn echoed faintly through the rain. Finally, Emma gathered her things, sliding the tablet into her bag. Monday's presentation isn't about you or me. It's about the company. Remember that. She walked out, heels clicking down the hallway, leaving him alone with the sound of rain and the gnawing truth he didn't want to admit, that she was right, and that somehow made it worse. The Monday morning client presentation for Project Apex should have been Mark's moment to prove himself. Instead, it became the first public crack in his professional facade. The boardroom was filled with the kind of people whose time was measured in thousands of dollars per hour. Department heads, senior executives, and the CEO himself. Emma sat beside Alexander at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her eyes fixed on the large screen as Mark began his pitch. He spoke confidently, clicking through slides that detailed market forecasts, strategic rollouts, and risk assessments. But midway through, a small discrepancy appeared, an outdated statistic on projected market share, just a minor oversight, but enough to make Alexander raise an eyebrow. "Where did this data come from?" Alexander asked, his tone neutral but firm. Mark hesitated, scrolling quickly through his notes. "From the research department's latest report." Emma leaned forward slightly. "That report was updated last Thursday, Mark. The numbers you're using are from last month's version." Her voice was calm, matter of fact, but the correction landed like a stone in the silent room. Mark forced a nod, trying to recover. "We'll update the slide immediately." But the damage was done. Alexander's gaze lingered on him a moment longer before turning back to the screen, and Mark felt the shift, a subtle cooling of the room's trust. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeated itself. In a budget review, a missing expense line prompted Alexander to question his attention to detail. In a follow-up client call, he misquoted a key delivery date, forcing a round of clarifying emails from the operations team. Each time, Emma was there, never openly critical, never gloating, but always quick to provide the correct figure, the accurate date, the missing detail. It was never aggressive enough to be called sabotage, but it was surgical. Every slip he made, no matter how small, seemed to happen when the right eyes were watching. Mark began to notice the ripple effect. In the break room, conversation stopped when he walked in. In departmental meetings, colleagues addressed Emma with a deference they didn't extend to him. A junior manager even bypassed him entirely, taking a question directly to Emma, explaining later she's closer to Alexander. The final blow came during the quarterly leadership review. Alexander had a habit of keeping these sessions small, just himself, the department head, and in this case, Emma. "Mark," Alexander began, flipping through the neatly bound report, "your team's numbers are fine overall, but I'm concerned about consistency. You're in a role where precision isn't optional. One wrong figure can cost us millions." Mark straightened in his seat. "With respect, I've been juggling multiple high-priority accounts. Minor oversights are—" "There's no such thing as a minor oversight at this level," Alexander cut in, his voice cool. He turned a page. "Emma tells me she's had to step in on several occasions to clarify details for clients. That can't become a habit." Mark's jaw tightened. He didn't look at her, but he could feel the weight of her presence beside Alexander. She had framed it perfectly, not accusing him, not undermining him directly, but presenting herself as the one who kept the machine running smoothly when he stumbled. Alexander closed the folder. "I expect better, and I'll be watching closely this quarter." When the meeting ended, Mark walked out with a controlled stride, but inside, anger and humiliation churned. Emma followed at a polite distance, her heels clicking softly against the marble. "Careful," she said quietly as she passed him in the corridor, her tone almost gentle. "In this company, people remember the mistakes more than the wins." He turned to face her, searching her expression for malice, but found only that infuriating calm. "Enjoying this?" he asked under his breath. She tilted her head as though considering it. "Not as much as you think. But I did warn you, this isn't about you and me. It's about whether you can survive here." Then she was gone, disappearing into Alexander's office without looking back. Mark stood there for a long moment, realizing that his downfall wasn't going to come from one catastrophic failure. It was going to be a slow, steady erosion. And Emma, whether by intent or instinct, was ensuring every chip in his armor was on display. It was past 9 in the evening when the offices of the Grant Corporation had finally gone quiet. The city lights stretched out beyond the glass walls, casting faint reflections across the empty executive floor. Most of the staff had left hours ago. The only sounds remaining were the low hum of the ventilation system and the occasional distant chime of the elevator. Mark sat at his desk, staring at the half-finished proposal on his screen, the cursor blinking like a silent accusation. He'd spent the day dodging sideways glances, enduring polite but loaded questions about his recent performance issues, and replaying every meeting where Emma's voice had cut through his own like a scalpel. He'd had enough. When he saw the lights still on in her corner office, technically not hers, but one she often used when working late, he closed his laptop, rose from his chair, and made his way down the hallway. His footsteps echoed in the empty space, a steady, controlled rhythm masking the tightness in his chest. Emma was leaning over the desk when he entered, reviewing a stack of documents. She didn't look surprised to see him. Without glancing up, she said, "It's late, Mark. Shouldn't you be home?" "I would be," he replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "If I wasn't spending every night trying to clean up after the messes you're making for me." That got her attention. She straightened, her expression unreadable, and slowly set her pen down. "Excuse me?" "Don't play innocent," he said, moving closer. "Every time I start to gain traction, you're right there, correcting me in front of Alexander, highlighting every small mistake like it's a catastrophe. You've been sabotaging me since the moment I walked in here." Her gaze sharpened, though her voice remained level. "Sabotaging you? Or making sure this company doesn't suffer because you can't be bothered to double-check your work?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Right? So this is just about the company? Has nothing to do with the fact that I left you?" For a moment, the air between them seemed to crystallize, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. Then she took a slow step toward him. "Do you really want to talk about that night?" she asked quietly. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "I remember it perfectly," she continued, her tone almost conversational. "I spent the afternoon cooking for you. I even opened the wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. And you," she let out a humorless breath, "you handed me divorce papers in the middle of dinner. Didn't even wait for dessert." Mark's throat tightened, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. "You didn't just leave me, Mark," she said, her voice dipping lower, colder. "You traded me for a promotion. You decided that standing next to me made you look, what was it the partners called it? Less marketable." She let the words hang there, heavy and sharp. "And you didn't think twice." "I did what I had to do for my career," he said, though the conviction in his voice wavered. Her lips curved, not in a smile, but in something far sharper. "And how's that career working out for you now?" He swallowed hard. "Let me make something very clear," she continued, taking another step closer until they were only a breath apart. "This is my world now. My husband owns this company. Every meeting you sit in, every client you pitch to, every project you touch, I am there. And if you think for a second that I need to sabotage you, you're giving yourself far too much credit. All I have to do is let you be exactly who you are, and you'll destroy yourself. He felt the sting in her words, the truth he didn't want to admit. Emma leaned back slightly, her gaze never wavering. So if you want to survive here, I suggest you stop looking for someone to blame and start figuring out how not to make me your enemy. She turned back to her desk, dismissing him without another word. The quiet finality of it was worse than any shouted argument could have been. Mark stood there for a moment, his fists tightening at his sides, the sound of her pen scratching against paper, the only thing breaking the silence. Then, without replying, he opened the door and walked out into the empty hallway, the click of it closing behind him echoing like a lock snapping shut. And for the first time since joining the Grant Corporation, he realized she wasn't just an obstacle, she was a wall. One he might never be able to climb. The quarterly board meeting was the kind of event that could make or break a career at the Grant Corporation. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about who could command the room, who could prove they were indispensable. Mark knew this was his chance to regain footing after weeks of missteps. He had been preparing for days, working late into the night, rehearsing his presentation until he could recite it in his sleep. The morning of the meeting, the air in the executive lounge was charged. Board members, shareholders, and senior leadership moved with purpose, exchanging brisk handshakes and tight smiles. Mark arrived early, his suit pressed to perfection, his slides loaded and triple-checked. This time, there would be no mistakes. The boardroom itself was a spectacle. Polished mahogany tables stretching the length of the room, city skyline pouring in through floor-to-ceiling windows, and at the head, Alexander Grant, calm and unreadable. Emma sat to his right, a vision of composed authority in a deep navy dress, her hair in a sleek twist. She didn't look at Mark as he entered, but he felt her presence all the same. When Alexander called on him to present the strategic expansion plan for the firm's Asia-Pacific division, Mark rose, his confidence high. He spoke clearly, gesturing to the projected slides behind him. His analysis was sharp, his delivery smooth. For a moment, he could almost feel the shift, people leaning in, nodding. Maybe this was the turning point. Then came the questions. One board member asked about the projected cost of regulatory compliance in Singapore. Mark began to answer, but Emma's voice cut in smoothly. "If I may," she said, turning toward the board member, "the updated forecast actually places that figure 15% higher than what's on Mark's slide. I reviewed the latest market report yesterday." Heads turned toward her. Mark froze, mentally scrambling. He hadn't seen that updated report. She continued, her tone measured. "It's a minor adjustment, but an important one when we're talking about long-term sustainability in that market." Alexander nodded approvingly. "Good catch, Emma." The conversation moved on, but Mark's momentum was gone. Another question came, this time about projected partnerships in South Korea. He began his explanation, only for Emma to add, "And we should note the recent policy changes that could delay entry by up to 6 months. It's worth building flexibility into the timeline." Again, Alexander gave her a brief smile. Exactly the kind of strategic insight we need. Mark felt the heat rising in his neck. Each interjection was surgical, never directly discrediting him, but highlighting that she had knowledge and foresight he apparently lacked. By the time he finished, the energy in the room had shifted completely. The board members weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. When he sat down, Alexander closed the folder in front of him and addressed the table. "Given the evolving challenges in these markets, I believe we need someone overseeing this account who can anticipate these shifts in real time. Emma has already demonstrated that capability, and I want her directly involved moving forward." There was a pause. Then Alexander turned to Mark. "You'll transition your responsibilities to her by the end of the week and move to the domestic accounts division. I expect you'll give her your full cooperation." The words hit harder than he expected. The domestic division was a step down. Less prestige, smaller budgets, fewer eyes on his work. It was a demotion dressed in polite language, delivered in front of every person who mattered in the company. Mark forced a tight smile and nodded. "Of course," he said, though his voice felt strangled in his throat. The meeting moved on, but for him, the rest was a blur. Every polite glance, every neutral expression from his colleagues seemed to carry the same message. He had been outplayed. When it finally ended, people rose, chairs scraping back, conversations breaking out in low murmurs. Alexander and Emma stood together, speaking quietly with a board member. Mark lingered for a moment, then gathered his things and left without looking back. But as he stepped into the hallway, her voice drifted after him. Not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but just enough for the words to land. "See, Mark? Sometimes power isn't taken. It's given to the one who earns it." He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The cold certainty settled in his gut. Whatever game they'd been playing, it was over, and she had won. The day after the board meeting, the office carried an unusual hum, subdued, watchful, the way people instinctively lower their voices when change is in the air. Word of Mark's reassignment had already made its way through the corridors. No one spoke of it openly, but the glances were there, sympathetic from some, faintly amused from others. Emma walked into the executive wing with her usual poise, heels tapping steadily against the polished floor. She didn't need to seek him out. She already knew where he would be. Mark's office door was open, and inside, the man who once dismissed her without hesitation was standing over a half-packed box. His desk was bare, except for a few scattered papers, a framed photo of a younger version of himself at some corporate event, and the now familiar sheen of failure clinging to the air around him. His suit jacket was draped over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled up as he methodically cleared drawers. Stapler, pens, a small crystal award from his last job, the detritus of a career that had once seemed unstoppable. He glanced up as she appeared in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His eyes were tired, darker than she remembered, his shoulders carrying a weight that went far beyond a demotion. "You came to see the wreckage?" he asked finally, his voice edged with bitterness. Emma didn't step inside. She simply stood there, composed. "I came to see you off." He huffed a laugh that held no real humor. "Mission accomplished, then? You got what you wanted." Her head tilted slightly. "What I wanted was a life without being underestimated. That's exactly what I have." His mouth tightened, but he said nothing. He returned to packing, the quiet thud of objects landing in the box, filling the space between them. She didn't rush him, didn't offer false comfort. She let the silence speak for itself. When the last item was placed in the box, Mark straightened and looked at her again. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of the man who once thought he could outgrow her, who believed she'd fade quietly into the background while he moved forward. Now, standing in his half-empty office with his pride in pieces, he seemed to understand just how wrong he'd been. "I never thought I'd end up answering to you," he admitted quietly. "You didn't," she corrected. "You answered to yourself. I just made sure everyone saw the truth." Before he could reply, a familiar voice carried down the hall. "Emma?" Alexander appeared at the far end, effortlessly commanding the space with his presence. He extended a hand toward her. She crossed the threshold of the office without another glance at Mark, her fingers fitting into her husband's with the ease of something unshakable. As they walked away, she felt his gaze following her, heavy with things he'd never say. But she didn't turn back. The clatter of the elevator doors opening swallowed the moment, and by the time they stepped inside, Mark's office, and everything it represented, was already receding into the past. When the elevator descended, Alexander glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "All done?" She met his eyes and returned the smile, calm and certain. All done. And in that instant, Emma knew it wasn't just about winning or revenge. It was about balance, restoring what had been taken from her that night 3 years ago, when she'd walked out into the cold with a suitcase. Now she left with her head high, her dignity intact, and her life firmly in her own hands. This time, she wasn't the one leaving broken.